Welcome back to the Historical Reality Checks. Today we are diving into the horrifying story of Jack the Ripper in the year 1888, the heart of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, a city of progress, invention, and unimaginable wealth, but also a city of shadows. In the East End, in the crowded district of Whitechapel, life could not have been more different from the glittering West End ballrooms. Here, narrow alleys twisted between crumbling tenements. Gas lamps struggled to pierce the thick fog, while the stench of refuse and sweat lingered in the air. This was a place of poverty, of hunger, of desperation. Men laboured in factories for pennies, women sold matches, flowers, and sometimes themselves just to make it through the night. The streets were filled with orphans, beggars, and drunkards. For many it seemed there was no way out. And then came the terror. One by one, women began to fall victim to a killer unlike any London had ever known. His crimes were brutal, his methods horrifying, and his identity a mystery that has endured for more than a century. He was never caught, never named, and yet his legend grew. To this day he remains one of history's most infamous figures, a faceless ghost lurking in the fog of Victorian London. This is the story of Jack the Ripper. To understand Jack the Ripper, we first need to understand Whitechapel itself. In the late 19th century, London's population had exploded. The city had become the beating heart of a vast empire, but its growth came at a cost. In the East End, tens of thousands were crammed into overcrowded slums, where conditions were little better than medieval. Whitechapel was notorious. Rows of dilapidated lodging houses lined the narrow, twisting streets. Whole families often shared a single room, and in the worst cases, strangers slept side by side on filthy mattresses, paying a penny or two for a space on the floor. Some houses even charged a halfpenny for the privilege of sleeping standing up, leaning against a rope strung across the room. The air was thick with smoke from factories and the stench of horse manure, refuse, and unwashed bodies. Disease thrived in these conditions. Tuberculosis, typhus, and cholera claimed lives at alarming rates. For women, survival was especially harsh. Many found themselves widowed or abandoned, with no way to earn a living. Prostitution became the last resort, with estimates suggesting thousands of women in Whitechapel relied on it just to afford food or shelter. They worked the gaslit streets at night, hoping to earn a few pennies, all the while facing constant danger from drunken clients, violent pimps, and the ever-present threat of disease. Crime was part of daily life. Street gangs roamed the alleys. Drunken brawls broke out nightly in the public houses. The police, undermanned and distrusted, struggled to keep order. And yet, amid this misery, there was also resilience. Street markets buzzed with life. Children played in the alleys, their laughter echoing between crumbling walls. Families clung to small joys, a warm meal, a shared song, a pint of ale after a long day's work. This was the backdrop to the Ripper murders, a district already drowning in poverty and despair, now gripped by a fear that seemed to creep into every dark corner. In the autumn of 1888, as the fog rolled in and the gas lamps flickered, Whitechapel became a hunting ground. Historians debate how many women Jack the Ripper actually killed. Some believe there were as many as 11 victims, but most agree on what are known as the canonical five women murdered in the autumn of 1888. Their deaths so similar and brutal that they are almost certainly the work of the same hand. These are their stories. Mary Ann Nichols. The first of the five, Mary Ann, known as Polly, was 43 years old. Her life had been hard. She had struggled with poverty, separated from her husband, and relied on casual work and the lodging houses of Whitechapel. On the night of August 31st, 1888, Polly was turned away from her lodging house because she didn't have the fourpence needed for a bed. She told the keeper, "I'll soon get my doss money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got." Then she went back into the night. Her body was found just before dawn in Bucks Row, her throat slashed, her abdomen mutilated. The police at first thought it a gang killing, but the savagery hinted at something else, something worse. Annie Chapman. Just over a week later, on September 8th, another woman's life was taken. Annie Chapman, 47, was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. Like Polly, she'd been struggling with poverty and alcoholism, staying in lodging houses when she could afford them. Her throat was cut, her body mutilated. The killer had removed organs, something that suggested knowledge of anatomy. Panic began to spread. This was no ordinary murder. Elizabeth Stride. On the night of September 30th, 1888, the killer struck again. Elizabeth Stride, 44, was found in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street. But unlike the others, her injuries were less severe. Her throat was cut, but her body was not mutilated. Some believe the Ripper was interrupted, forced to flee before he could finish. If that's true, it means he was still hungry for blood that night. Catherine Eddowes. Less than an hour later, in the early hours of that same night, the Ripper killed again. Catherine Eddowes, 46, was found in Mitre Square. This time the mutilations were worse than ever. Her face was disfigured, parts of her body removed. The city was now in a frenzy. Newspapers screamed of the monster in human form stalking Whitechapel. The name Jack the Ripper appeared in print for the first time, tied to a taunting letter sent to the press. Mary Jane Kelly, the last of the canonical five and the youngest. Mary Jane Kelly was just 25 years old. Unlike the others, she had a small room of her own at 13 Miller's Court. On November 9th, her landlord sent for the rent collector. He forced open her door and found the most horrific scene of all. Mary Jane had been mutilated beyond recognition. The sheer violence of the crime shocked even hardened detectives. If the earlier murders had been terrifying, this one was unspeakable. The killing stopped after Mary Jane Kelly. At least no other murder matched the Ripper's particular brutality. But by then the damage had been done. London was terrified. Whitechapel was paralysed with fear, and the world had been introduced to a killer who seemed to vanish into the fog. The brutal murders of Whitechapel threw London's police into chaos. Scotland Yard and the Metropolitan Police were under enormous pressure. The public demanded answers, and the newspapers fanned the flames of panic. But the truth was the police had little to work with. Crime scenes were poorly secured. Crowds gathered before detectives could even begin their work. Forensic science, as we know it today, simply didn't exist. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no way to analyse fibres or blood. Investigators relied on witness statements and hunches, and in the dark, foggy alleys of Whitechapel, eyewitnesses were unreliable at best. As the murders continued, the police presence in the East End grew. Officers patrolled the streets at night, and plainclothes detectives prowled the pubs and lodging houses. But Jack the Ripper always seemed one step ahead, and then came the letters. The press received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer, but a few stood out. The first was the infamous Dear Boss letter, postmarked September 27th, 1888. In it, the writer mocked the police and signed the note with a name that would soon become infamous: Jack the Ripper. Another note followed, the Saucy Jackie postcard, boasting about the double murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. The handwriting matched the Dear Boss letter. Was it really from the killer, or a hoax from a journalist looking to sell papers? We may never know, but the most chilling correspondence was the From Hell letter, sent to George Lusk, head of a Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. The letter came in a small box, along with half of a human kidney, preserved in alcohol. Catherine Eddowes had been found with one of her kidneys removed. Was this grisly package genuine, or the work of a cruel prankster? Historians are still divided. The police, meanwhile, were divided too. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police had overlapping jurisdictions, and cooperation between them was poor. Detectives pursued dozens of leads, but they had no consistent suspect, no clear trail. Every man in Whitechapel was a potential suspect in the public's eyes. Foreigners, butchers, doctors, and even Jewish immigrants were targeted by angry mobs. The Ripper's shadow cast suspicion on the entire East End. By the end of 1888, the trail had gone cold. The murders stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and the police were left with nothing but unanswered questions, contradictory statements, and a fearful population. Jack the Ripper had slipped through their fingers, and into history. Perhaps the most haunting question in the Jack the Ripper case is this: who was he? Over the decades, more than 100 suspects have been named. Some theories are grounded in evidence, others in rumour and wild speculation. But among them, a handful stand out. Montague John Druitt was a barrister and part-time schoolteacher. In December of 1888, just weeks after the last canonical murder, his body was pulled from the River Thames. Some police officials at the time believed Druitt had taken his own life after the killing stopped, suggesting he was the Ripper. But the evidence is thin. Druitt had no known ties to Whitechapel, and apart from the timing of his death, there was little to link him to the crimes. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant, Kosminski was a barber living in the East End. He suffered from severe mental illness and was eventually committed to an asylum in 1891. In later years, police officials privately named him as a likely suspect. More recently, DNA analysis of a shawl allegedly found at one of the crime scenes suggested a possible link to Kosminski, though the reliability of that evidence has been hotly debated. Michael Ostrog. A career criminal and con man, Ostrog was suspected by police largely because of his history of violence and deception, but investigators could never place him near the crime scenes at the right times, and his candidacy has largely faded over the years. Walter Sickert, the painter. Walter Sickert has become one of the most controversial suspects. In the 20th century, author Patricia Cornwell argued that Sickert was the Ripper, pointing to supposed clues in his artwork and claiming to have linked his DNA to some of the letters. But most historians dismiss this theory. The evidence is circumstantial at best, and Sickert's career as a respected artist makes him an unlikely culprit. Prince Albert Victor. Perhaps the most sensational theory of all, that Jack the Ripper was Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria. According to this conspiracy, the prince's alleged affairs with working-class women had to be covered up, and the murders were part of a royal plot. It's a story that captured the imagination of novelists and filmmakers, but serious historians have found no evidence to support it. Prince Albert Victor wasn't even in London during some of the killings. In truth, none of these suspects can be proven guilty. The Ripper left no clear trace, no confession, no trial, just theories, speculation, and endless debate. Perhaps that is part of the mystery's power. The Ripper is whoever the public imagines him to be: a madman, a doctor, a foreigner, a prince. And in that uncertainty, his legend has endured. More than a century has passed since the autumn of 1888. London has changed. The slums of Whitechapel have long been cleared away, the gas lamps replaced by neon and electric light, but the shadow of Jack the Ripper still lingers. Why has his story endured when so many other crimes have been forgotten? Part of it lies in the mystery. We do not know who he was. The absence of an answer has left space for speculation, for theories, for endless retellings. Each generation has projected its own fears onto the faceless figure who haunted those foggy streets. But there is more to it. The Ripper case revealed the deep divisions in Victorian society. The gulf between rich and poor, the plight of women forced into desperate lives, the failures of institutions meant to protect them. Jack the Ripper was not only a killer, he became a mirror, reflecting the darkness that already existed in London's East End. The murders also changed the way we think about crime. Before the Ripper, the idea of a serial killer was barely understood. Afterward, investigators, journalists, and the public began to recognise a new kind of criminal. One who killed not for gain, but for something far more disturbing. And of course, the Ripper entered popular culture. He has been the subject of countless books, plays, films, and theories. His name has become shorthand for evil. His shadow cast far beyond Whitechapel. Yet in remembering him, we must not forget the women whose lives were taken. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They were not just victims of a mystery, they were real people, living hard lives in a harsh world, cut down before their time. Jack the Ripper remains an unsolved case, a phantom in history. A reminder that sometimes the darkest figures are the ones we never truly see. The fog has lifted, the streets have changed, but the legend of the Ripper, the faceless figure in the shadows of Whitechapel, will never fade.